I wanted to move beyond this into another key announcement that actually originated in last year's budget, which was the new employment generation scheme. 10,000 crore was allotted last year. In the revised estimates, we see around 6,800 crore has been spent. But this year, the jump is to 20,000 crore. So two parts to the question. How confident are you that this scheme is going to work? Because initially we noticed that the takeoff was not that smooth or that fast as you might have expected. What outcomes will this 20,000 crore yield in terms of the new employment generation scheme?
Well, there were a total of 5 schemes announced in the July budget. And between July and February now, you're hardly talking about 5-6 months. Most schemes, inclusive of the internship scheme on which there was a question today in Parliament in Rajya Sabha, have all picked up very well. Now, it's a question of making people aware that this scheme is running, it has this objective, people can happily come and enroll. It is rolling on and we need to have more awareness on them.
Ma'am, the linchpin of the last couple of Sitharaman budgets has been augmentation of government spends through capacity expansion. This year, that process seems to have paused at levels which you allocated last year, and you couldn't spend what you'd allocated. So question number 1, why could the government not spend the entire amount which was allocated for capacity expansion? Are there constraints on the ability of the Indian state at the center and at the state to actually go out and spend? Is that why you haven't increased allocation? Secondly, you've left 1 lakh crore rupees on the table for the taxpayer. Many economists would argue, and you've mentioned this in the past, that the maximum multiplier is for spends on infrastructure, spends on capacity expansion. Therefore, if we are to find spurs for growth, would that not have been the best route to go, or do you feel that that route has now reached a saturation?
That continues. Our CapEx numbers have not come down, despite what Rahul would want to tell you. 11.11 lakh crores has gone up to 11.21 lakh crores.
But the actual spending is lesser, man. Actual spending is lesser.
Yes, it was an election. That's the question he's asked, right?
Yeah.
That's the question Rahul is asking. It was an election year. Entire first quarter, and even, I would say, the part of second quarter, it was still just beginning to happen. And an amount like that to be spent between center and state does take time. And we'll probably catch up with a better number in the fourth quarter this time, before 31st March. But reasons are obvious, and therefore all of us to see. Elections did slow down your capital expenditure, but we have not cut it down. On the contrary, it's 10% more than the RE.
But ma'am, क्या यही वजह है कि जिसके वजह से आपने जो स्कीम्स इसके पहले डिक्लेयर की थी, जैसे पोषण है, जल जीवन मिशन है, प्रधानमंत्री ग्राम सड़क योजना है, क्रॉप इंश्योरेंस स्कीम है, या फिर आपके स्किल इंडिया के प्रोग्राम्स हैं, उसके लिए जो एस्टिमेटेड बजट था और जो एक्चुअल स्पेंड है, उसमें जो फर्क नजर आता है, वो क्या इसी के वजह से जिसका आपने रीजन दिया?
बिल्कुल इसी के वजह से ही, क्योंकि पोषण डिस्ट्रिक्ट एंड स्टेट लेवल में जो काम को होना है, वो होने के लिए हर administration was involved in the election, and therefore there could have been some slowdown there. But our allocations have not been cut down.
But on the question of saturation, do you feel, because there's only a certain amount of roadways that can be built, you can build again in a 10-year cycle. The question of the absorptive capacity of the Indian economy to deal with CapEx, and you've been raising the concern about India Inc. not doing enough to invest back in the India story, despite your significant reductions in corporate taxes. We've seen, ma'am, that according to a FICCI study, in the past 4 years, corporate profits for Nifty 500 companies have gone up 400%, but salaries for those sitting here watching you haven't kept pace. As finance minister, how much of a concern is that for you, and how are you trying to change that?
As regards your first question, Rahul, which are those big ministries which have huge CapEx? We have not reduced anything. In fact, on the contrary, have increased the allocation. Railways, roadways, that is the highways, defense, home, They are all creating assets and they are big spenders on that. Home, because you see the vibrant villages in the border roads. Defense has its own set of asset building. Railways and roadways have not even exhausted 50% of all their large plan. So this narrative that there isn't enough absorption capacity is completely wrong. There's enough and more work to do on capital expenditure, at least in these 4 ministries. And they're big ticket spenders. So that's very clear. But if you're talking about private sector, in our engagement with the private sector, we've also highlighted the fact that many of them are probably sitting with passive investments, where they have invested it and earning interest out of it. They can always look at newer capacity building, but they are making a commercial decision as to when the market would be ready for their additional investment. After a point, I cannot speak to them about it.
Ma'am, you're talking about this 1 lakh crore rupees, which is now additional in the hands of people. How significant is it and meaningful is it when it comes to moving the needle in the economy and boosting consumption? And how soon are we going to see an impact in the economy of that?
Well, it's got to be only from 1st April, subject to the bill getting passed. I wouldn't put a number about how much is going to be spent and how much is going to be saved. It's going to be split between the two. And the popular narrative that fast-moving capital goods or consumer goods are not being purchased as much as before should see an audience, should see a opening. And as you go, discretionary spending can also increase, buying the next best car that you want to own. And also looking at the various ways in saving and investments in the various instruments that are available can also see some change. Banks probably will have better deposit now with them.
Since we are talking about growth, how critical is the global impetus to India's growth? We are seeing what is happening in the United States. You have dealt with the commerce and industry portfolio as well, and we've seen with the first round of tariff impositions by the United States, global markets have reacted. There are worries that we might see once again a supply side shock and global growth going down. Is that the most critical factor to watch out for as far as India's economy is concerned?
It's something which you anyway will have to watch. You can't speculate on it even though you're watching it. We'll have to wait and see what kind of action is going to come at all, if at all it comes. But I would at this time prepare myself for 2 things. One, the fallout of actions already announced on China or Canada or Mexico, although some of them, for instance, the Mexican one is going to be deferred for a month. We'll have to see what that is going to impact India indirectly, Indian markets indirectly, for which of course we are keeping a watch and also being prepared in some ways. But what exactly is going to be the direct action on India is something which I can't speculate on.
Did you have the threat of President Trump at the back of your head? Your finance secretary was quoted as saying, we want to signal India is not tariff king. Now the guy who says India is tariff king is Donald Trump. So in some senses, by reducing customs on big motorcycles, etc., and the changes in the nuclear law, is it in some ways a message to the new American president, India wants to be friends, we don't want to be on your wrong side?
Well, on the customs duty again, 2022 budget, I said, India cannot afford to be high on tariffs. But even as we are wanting our small and medium sector industries to grow, MSMEs to grow, and MSMEs are contributing, particularly for engineering exports, nearly 40% of all our exports. If they need to import critical minerals, which we don't have in this country, and if they need some intermediary products which we cannot produce in this country, I need to look at the ways in which the basic customs duty is burdening them, and I need to remove it. Also, there was a lot of evergreening of duties. Anti-dumping duty imposed 30 years ago, 25 years ago, are being repeated. even if we have had capacities within the country and we don't anymore need that kind of protection. So from 22, we are actually doing this exercise, and in this budget, I've clearly announced that 8 were already removed, 7 I am removing in this budget, and only 8 more are pending. The rationalization has been happening since 22. It is one thing, again, for not just one administration, the US, even the World Trade Organization, any other developed country which wants to have some trade market access to India, always quotes your tariffs are too high. And we also have a sort of conflicting situation where you've got an FTA with some countries, and because of the FTA, you have duty-free import of the same commodity on which you've levied a huge BCD. So preventing other countries from exporting into India, whereas with the FTA countries for the same thing, you're allowing duty-free imports. So most of these smart developed countries would route it through the FTA country, and we're only telling ourselves how we've got this protection wall. So we had to clean up all this, and that's what has happened in this budget. You can read it whichever way you want.
Which is a good thing. I mean, less but it's also very complex in the current scenario with President Trump doing what he is.